I've been remote since about 1999 or 2000. I've been a remote employee. So a long time. And I will never go back. I can't work in offices. I've lost the ability to tune people out when they're talking nearby me. I can't do that. And yet I know that if I don't get that at least occasional real human time with people, I wither. It's terrible.
From Tuple, this is Distributed, where we show how world-class engineers and their teams tackle the challenges of remote work. I'm Jack Hanna, your host. Hey everyone. Today we're talking with Ian Varley. Ian is a principal architect at Salesforce, where he has worked for the past 15 years. Now, Ian has a somewhat particular role at Salesforce in that his core remit is actually to keep everyone informed on everything that they need to be informed on, which is a pretty daunting task for an organization with 80,000 plus people and many thousands of engineers. So in today's conversation, what we're going to talk about is how he goes about helping folks borg up and mind meld. We're going to talk about overcoming silos at Salesforce scale, what it means to be a principal architect, as well as how he thinks about using LLMs in today's workflow. It's an incredibly interesting conversation, so I hope you enjoy. Ian, welcome to the show. We're psyched to have you on. So in our pre-interview, you posed this question, how do you borg up? And it struck me as this really sort of simple and clear way to illustrate the challenge of collaborating at such scale. Obviously, you at Salesforce, it's a massive scale. And I think some of this stuff is exacerbated when folks are remote or globally distributed. And so I wanted to start here at this sort of high level. What does it mean to borg up, and why would anybody even want that?
I love that you picked up on that particular phrase, which is an incredibly silly phrase, right? Like, obviously, no one wants to actually be assimilated into the Borg. Like, that's creepy and dystopian and horrible, right? But I like the phrase partly for the shock value of it, right? Because like inside a company, like ideally what you want is something like what they've got, which is that there's like no barriers between sharing understanding from one mind to another mind, right? And so like to me, that is, that's a very desirable state. It's obviously impossible to actually get there, right? Short of, having the cables plugged into the back of your head. But I think it's an interesting thought experiment. Like, well, how can we get closer? Do we want to get closer? Are we too siloed? Are we not siloed enough? I think there's really interesting questions there.
I've heard you talk on another podcast a little bit about some of the techniques that you've recommended or experimented with for communicating different things, using LLMs as a mechanism for making it much more efficient. Mm-hmm. You have a pretty interesting perspective on how to use LLMs to do these things. So talk me through that a little bit. How do you approach this using LLMs?
Yeah, to make these tools a net positive, I think you kind of have to think about it in a couple different ways. First of all, you have to think about it from is this actually effective? Right? Like, am I actually creating a thing here that is really representative of this idea that I have or this thing that I want? And if you just go to an LLM and you type in, hey, write a thing for me, it's like that cartoon, where like one person says like, hey, write a thing for me. And then they send it to somebody else. And that other person says, hey, summarize this thing for me. And, no human actually read the thing in the middle, right? Which is obviously dumb. And so, and yet at the same time, like, well, but there is obviously so much potential here in these tools. So I'll just tell you about a couple of the ways that I've seen them, that I've used them myself, and that I've seen them used in ways that actually contribute here to the sort of uses them as like complementary cognitive technologies rather than, just do my intellectual work for me. One of them, and this is a thing that I see people, that happens a lot. So I mentioned, writing is hard. Writing feels hard, right? One technique I've been using lately to great effect is kind of using the LLM a little bit like a thought partner, in the sense of, I want the LLM to ask me questions, and then I answer the questions by just sort of talking or explaining or defending myself or whatever it is. And then I take the output of that, which is of course not in the structure that somebody else would want to absorb it. And then I hand that back to an LLM and say, make a first draft out of this in the way that someone else would want to absorb it. So for example, we were having a meeting just recently about an internal like educational engineering summit we're doing. And there was this one particular point that we wanted to clarify for people. And one of the people on the team was like, okay, I guess I'll write a doc about that. I'll, try to get it done in the next couple of days. And I said, oh, okay, hold on a minute. Like, this, what it is you want to say. What if instead you just open up a Google Meet, turn on transcription, and just like explain yourself, like explain it. Doesn't have to be right, or it doesn't have to be, clean and clear. It can be as messy as you want, but then take the transcript, pop it into an LLM and say, hey, can you like turn this into a first draft for me? And she did it, and she came back and she was like, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Like she was like that. I was done in 7 minutes with this thing that I thought was going to take me a day. Right. And so there's this friction that's kind of inherent in this notion of like trying to, clearly externalize something that you kind of already get. And if that's the situation you're in, boy, that can really accelerate you. Now I say that, but I also want to like take a little bit of a skeptical side here as well. Because I feel like, sometimes people think about AI as like a little bit of a magic lamp, right? Like when you're presented with what a large language model can do, especially like the latest, the frontier models and so forth, like it can do anything, right? And yes, it's uneven and you have to kind of get good at figuring out what it can do. But, if you had a real life magic lamp, like what would you do with it? And it's like, well, I don't know. What would you ask for from a magic lamp? Like, I want to live forever, or, I want infinite wealth or whatever. But like, we all know, like those things turn out to be more like the monkey's paw. Like you get the wish you asked for, but only later did you realize that was not what your heart really wanted. And it didn't make you happy and probably made you worse off. Right. So like, you can't ask for immortality or infinite wealth from an LLM. Not yet anyway, or you can ask, but you won't get it. But like the obvious thing to say is like, do my writing for me, do my intellectual work for me. Right. And, I think for people, for thought workers who never really learned or internalized the pleasure of writing, that turns into just like, hey, just write it for me. Right. And a lot of people, I get it. Like people are overstretched with the demands of modern work. I'm in myself in that bucket much of the time. Right. And so like, I feel like those things are kind of monkey's paws, right? First of all, being forced to express your ideas clearly in writing is painful, but it's also incredibly valuable, right? It's like, that is like, it's not really in my mind. It's not all that separable from just getting smarter or better at thinking, right? And if there's nothing forcing you to do that, you're just maybe not going to do that, right? Now, maybe other people have different opinions about that, but like, that's the thing that I worry about when I think about this sort of like, well, just turn it into a piece of writing for me. Like there is important thinking you're not doing when you are in that stance.
Absolutely. I experience this personally all of the time where I'm needing to communicate with somebody who's in a different time zone, and my knee jerk might be send them an audio note. I record the audio note. I listen to the audio note, and I'm like, this was not at all clear. Let me write down some notes to send another audio note. I write down some notes. I record another audio note. I listen to it. It's still not clear. I change my notes, and I look at it and just say, man, my notes are really just what I want to say now. And then I hit send on the written thing instead of the audio note. So that process of turning and clarifying and taking the time to write something that is clear absolutely sharpens your thinking. And without it is kind of a scary place we might find ourselves in.
Well, and it's funny because I have this sort of, maxim I say to myself, which is writing is thinking, right? Like the thinking, it's not like your brain just figures a thing out most of the time and it snaps and then you just have to kind of export it into words. That is the process of figuring a thing out. And you'll write it down the first time and you'll be like, oh, I wasn't really clear. What did I really mean about that? Or like, oh, I hadn't really thought that through and that's actually a terrible idea, whatever that is. And so that's one of the problems. There's actually another problem with this approach too, which is that like when you use especially kind of vanilla AI written stuff, I think it kind of blunts your communication. Like it sort of just like makes it into a dull knife. Like it sort of lowers all of our expectations about how incisive writing should be. Like we all kind of live in a world where like, especially these days, like, tech is in the business world, like text is sort of meandering. It doesn't get to the point. You get a big email from a group and it's sort of, it just says a bunch of obvious kind of average things instead of like novel and powerful things. And like, to be fair, like that is just sort of, that's always been maybe kind of how business writing is. Like business writing just kind of sucks, I guess. Right. But this kind of like LLM kind of normalize that. It's like, well, that's just how it is. And like, so I think about it as sort of like the enshittification of communication. Right. And so that's the other concern that I have when you think about using the LLM in the way of like, oh, just write a thing. Now, but the alternative to that, there is a really good alternative to that, which is using it as a thought partner to challenge you. For example, I have a thing I've written. What's wrong with it? Or like, how could I make it more incisive? Or like, hey, if I had to summarize this into bullet points, what would be the least important 3 of them. And can you just get that out of this piece of writing? Anything like that, right? Where you're saying, like, I think Hillel Wayne, made the phrase that like LLMs are like calculators for words. And when you think about them in that way, it's like, oh yeah, they can permute a blob of concepts and ideas in lots of different ways. And it's kind of up to you as the driver to decide what ways am I using it to permute this thing, right? And so like, I can imagine in your case, if you said like, I made a voice note, and then you're like, you give it to the LLM and you're like, what's unclear about this? And then it'll be, well, I'm not sure whether you mean X or Y. And I don't think, and this gets really tricky in the current world, because what the other thing that your brain is doing that the LLM doesn't have access to is your brain knows the other people that you're communicating with. It knows what they know and what they don't know. Right. And so like, that's the piece that makes it a little extra tricky to kind of use LLMs in these cases. So you have to be very smart as you're trying to use it in this way, but there absolutely are ways that you can do it.
Yeah. Well, zooming out for a second, because I know we've talked about this quite a bit. I think it's fascinating, this particular approach to using LLMs to communicate ideas. I guess we're sort of assuming with this line of questioning and conversation that folks want to do that or think that it's worthwhile to do that. So if we were to zoom out again, just briefly, why is it worth taking the time to make sure that within an engineering organization that you're communicating clearly across functions and across roles? Because you talked about how in the Ben Grobel episode or in other episodes, talk about the importance of information flow, and you kind of expanded that to the importance of shared understanding. You sort of took it as fact that, yeah, we all agree, or we all have a shared understanding that shared understanding is something that's worth pursuing. And so I don't know if you have any examples of where the lack of shared understanding really bit you or somebody else in the butt, or if you have some sort of perspective as to why this is something worth pursuing. I think that would be an interesting place to unpack, because I think so many organizations actually massively prioritize and incentivize individualistic behavior. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all.
I'll give you a couple of examples of cases where I've, just sort of personally seen it go wrong. And then I'll maybe tell you a couple of things that I do in terms of my work to try to counter that. Salesforce has made a number of acquisitions over the years, this is public record. And when you make acquisitions as a company that sort of grew up organically, well, you used to have 1 of something, or maybe 2 or 3 of something. And now you have 9 of that thing, right? 9 different versions of that thing, right? Oh, we have Kubernetes and Mesos, or, we have 16 different workflow engines or whatever, right? And I think there's a tendency, like you want to simplify these things, right? But without actual shared understanding of the purpose of these things, you're in danger of making really dumb decisions. There's an analogy I like to use, and I'm not a particularly like handy guy in terms of like work, tools and workshops and so forth. I am aware that there's a pair of tools called a drill and an impact driver, and they look really similar. They're like little sort of gun-shaped things with a spinny bit on the end, right? But they do really different things. If you're a carpenter, a drill makes a hole in a piece of wood, and a impact driver drives a screw into a piece of wood, right? Mm. And you can absolutely do the job of one with the other. You just kind of get a shitty result. Like it's just not as good. You didn't have the level of nuance that you needed to make the right decision. And so when you're faced with, I have, 6 different workflow systems, or I have, all the, different container orchestration approaches or whatever, if you take a sort of ham-fisted approach to trying to, get down to a single approach to something without any of that shared understanding, without any of that nuance, you get bad results, right? And I've seen this over and over again, not just at Salesforce, but at every company that I've worked with. That sort of grist of true, like shared understanding really, really has a huge, huge impact on the quality of the resulting solution that you get to. And it's not, this is a perfect case of where it's not just about information flow. Like, I know that you use Mesos, that I use Kubernetes, whatever that is, right? That's not, we didn't lack information. What we lacked was like that kind of more nuanced understanding of like, what problems do you solve with that? And why do you use it the way that you use it? Right. And that's expensive, right? It takes time and energy to get that shared understanding. It also takes a lot of psychological safety on the parts of the teams, because of course that's also part of what's going on. Is like, well, this is my baby. I don't want to throw out my baby, right? You have to get people to a point where they're like, no, we actually all have the same baby here. We're just trying to this is going to get gruesome. Why don't you just have to, sew the head of this baby onto the body of that baby or whatever. Okay. That metaphor didn't work out very well, but you know what I'm saying here is like, you can find incredibly cool creative solutions to all kinds of problems in the technical and engineering space, but it takes shared understanding. It takes us seeing eye to eye, trusting each other, understanding why we made the decisions we made, and then committing to like a path forward where we can actually, get really useful stuff together. And like, you had Cassia Scheffer on and she talked about like the complexity that arises when, 30 teams are trying to make architectural decisions that affect each other. But like, some of the problems that I think about are really big company problems, right? Like what happens when that's an order of magnitude or maybe 2 orders of magnitude, more like thousands of teams, right? And like, of course, like, wherever possible, you don't want to be in that situation in the first place, right? You want to have as much localization and decoupling and so forth. But there are going to be times when you still need the thing to behave like a single piece of software at the end of the day, right? So it becomes kind of fractal. You have multiple levels of grouping and so forth. Like people have their own processes locally. But, I think, back to Carlos's episode, I think he made a really good point that for this to work, for local autonomy and so forth to work, the individuals have to understand the context. They have to understand the business. Like in Carlos's case, that was like, all right, we're going to take these employees and we're going to put them in the stores with our POS solution, right? So they know what our customers are doing, right? But like, of course, when you have, tens of thousands of customers all over the world and they're big enterprise businesses and you have thousands of specialized feature teams, right? It's not as easy to do that, right? And yet you still need it for teams to be building the right software and doing it effectively and efficiently. They have to understand stuff. They have to understand the big picture. We are knowledge workers. We're not like factory line workers. And so, that's in large part, that's actually why I do all of the work that I do internally inside of Salesforce, is to just try to promote that,
Well, let's talk about some of that work. I mean, you wrote a piece called The 10 Principles of Architecture at Salesforce. And I think principle number 7 was about overcoming silos.
Yep.
And I'm assuming that as a principal architect, you have to think about this dynamic across teams, how things work, how systems work. How do we sew together the right parts of a baby to make this thing that we actually want? God, it got even more gruesome as I tried to work with it. But how do we take all of these component parts that have come together through acquisition, through specialized teams going off and doing their own thing? How do we take all of the parts and kind of work them together into this thing that we're driving forward together? And so, could you talk a little bit about how you approach this or think about this in your role?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a bit of a weird role, I guess. Like there's no such thing as a like typical day for me as a person. And I think I'm different from, many principal architects. I spent many years, decades working as a software engineer myself, right? I do have that, background of building and shipping systems. But these days I've kind of mutated, I guess, into a bit of a different role where the cheeky way that I describe my role at this company is my goal is just for everyone to understand everything that is useful for them to understand, right? Which is like, clearly that is impossible, but there is better and worse. And I try to get, more of the better stuff, and to do that, not just myself personally, but to sort of try to systematize that so that other people are doing the same behaviors and getting more of the same kind of effect. It's very oblique, and some days it's very frustrating, but it's also super fun. So like one of the things that I do is I work on an internal podcast at Salesforce. I have a face for radio, and that just really like it, it was something that we started and seemed to kind of hit a chord internally. And some of that is the distributed understanding part. Some of it is just humanizing this big company. As it turns out, when you're working at a giant company, you're just sort of surrounded by thousands and thousands of people who are sort of just like two-dimensional to you, kind of, right? I mean, they're obviously they're real interesting people and they're all different, but like part of what I try to do with the podcast is like just add a little bit of depth to people, which the podcast format is super good at, right? Like, oh, I hear the dumb jokes that this person makes, or they talked about, sewing a baby's head on another baby, whatever they said, right? And, so I think I get to know them a little better. And I feel like this company actually is made of people. It's not just megacorp, right? Some of it is that angle of it, and trying to kind of just really connect at that slightly deeper level. Not just what are we doing, but why are we doing it? And why are we doing it the way that we're doing it? And the podcast is super fun, by the way. I mean, I'm sure from doing this podcast. Like it's really cool to get to do that, because week over week, like I'm doing the same kind of physical work. Like I'm recording, I'm editing, whatever, but the content is totally different from week to week, which is really cool. Just the sheer, intellectual diversity of that. Like last week, I spoke to a woman named Fiona, who is a content designer. The week before that, I spoke to Brad Arkin, who's like the chief trust officer for Salesforce, right? The week before that, I talked to a person who works on the zero copy feature in Salesforce Data Cloud, which is like super interesting feature where it's like you can leave your data where it is, but still work on it in Salesforce. And that's there's an example where it's like, hey, when you first encounter a feature like that, and the way that the salespeople talk about it, it's like, oh, it's magic. It's just magic. But it's like, well, I'm an engineer. I don't believe in that kind of magic, right? But like that's my own personal background is I've worked on database implementation stuff for a long time. And so I was able to go with this person and ask them questions like, well, but how do you do the query predicate push down across the network barriers and so forth? And it turned into a really interesting conversation that went deeper, right? And so, sometimes it works like that, sometimes it doesn't. But so I think that, that's an example of the kind of work that I do to try to spread this kind of thing. I do lots of other stuff too. I'm also a sponsor for an internal conference that I mentioned earlier. We call it the Engineering Summit, that's like, we take the thousands of Scrum teams across the company, and we try to expose them to what are the cool development tools and practices and shared services that you might not know about that are out there that other people are using that might accelerate you, get you to go faster, right? And that's very different from working on the podcast, because like, oh yeah, I'm working with architects and leaders to kind of brainstorm content and prioritize, right? And to develop that into stories that people remember, right? So I think that if there is a theme of my work and the work of my team, it really is that. It's just trying to kind of promote this in a bunch of different ways.
When I saw the title Principal Architect, I would not have anticipated that the explanation of the role is what you said. How did it come to be that you find yourself in this role with this set of activities or responsibilities being your day-to-day or week-to-week?
Yeah. I mean, my title is indeed Principal Architect, but I think what I do is pretty far from your average principal architect, what they do. So I feel like, maybe an interesting way to talk about this would be to talk about an example of kind of how I evolved to be doing what I'm doing, right? So in general, like in software, if you're an architect or principal architect or staff engineer or something at that level, right? Your job is really not different from any other level of engineering. Your job is to ship products, right? And on one simple dimension, it's just kind of like, well, you've had, decades of experience. And so some stuff, your spidey sense is just more developed than a new engineer, right? And as many people on your podcast have said, like mentoring is a huge part of that job, right? Your job, this is something we say, your job as an architect is to make more senior engineers, right? Is to help people grow into that deeper knowledge and deeper context, deeper awareness, right? You also kind of have more, as a high level, like very experienced individual contributor, you also have more sway, to be honest, like because of your seniority. Like you could just like make decisions and cut through like a lot of analysis paralysis. Now, of course, that can be used for good or for evil, right? I've seen my share of people who like were just like, they were cocky and bad listeners and just sort of doctrinaires about like, how the right thing to do a thing is. They have like their theory or their opinion and they don't budge from it, even when the evidence is clearly in the other direction, right? So it's super important. Like when you promote or hire someone into a high level IC role, to be super careful to pay really close attention to like the social emotional side of what they do. Like, do they actually listen to people, right? Like if they're men, do they take women seriously? Questions like that. Those are like really important signals and cues that you have to be thinking about. So I think at least here at Salesforce, the job of an architect is not to just do all the like high level stuff and then hand it off to underlings to implement. Like maybe that's true in some shops, but that is a terrible approach for many reasons, right? It is much more true to say here that what is different about architects, I guess, is that they are less likely to ignore the strategic stuff, right? So like when you're hands-on coding all day long, you have plenty to do. You have plenty of tactical problems to solve. And generally speaking, those kinds of problems are like, they're really hard. Sometimes they take a long time. They're also like kind of more satisfying to work on than strategic problems, because at the end of the day, like you shipped a thing and it's in production and you're done and you're moving on to the next thing, right? So all things being equal, I think most engineers kind of default to the kind of engineering that they're used to, which is like, well, coding and related stuff, right? But sometimes on bigger projects, the strategic stuff just kind of gets to be big enough to be its own sort of full-time job, even if you do it really efficiently. I'll give you an example. About a decade ago, I was working on inside of Salesforce. The kind of underlying implementation is very data heavy, as you can imagine. I mean, it's basically just a database with web forms on top, right? So you have, the role that the database plays on the inside is very, very important. And it was a relational database. That's what it was built on in 1999. But we started hitting all these cases where it's like, oh no, we actually need much bigger scale data. This is many, many years before Data Cloud. And we said, well, we need to bring in additional kinds of databases. Like we need to bring in like a NoSQL store. And I had some experience with that prior to being at Salesforce. So they brought me in to kind of work on that. And we started a team and we decided, we went through a whole selection process. We decided to implement Apache HBase kind of as an additional system. And, we did have a bunch of tactical problems around actually implementing that, even with an off-the-shelf open source product. There's still a ton to do, right? And we even had multiple committers, like project committers on our team, contributing to open source, right? Doing all that deep technical work you got to do to bring the system up to the company's standards for stuff like security and availability, whatever, right? But there was another big bucket of work to do, which was at the time, we ran entirely in first-party infrastructure. This is like pre-Salesforce running a public cloud. And so bringing in a horizontally scalable data store was a huge challenge, huge change. We had to figure out how to get hardware, where to get it from, how to deploy it, when to deploy it, right? And so we had all these other teams working on stuff, right? And it gradually kind of became my role to sort of tie it together, to sell the value of the thing. Like, why are we doing it? Keep reminding people why we're doing it. Keep unblocking the teams that are sort of blocked in various ways. I wasn't managing anyone. I'm not a manager and I've never been a manager. But you sort of start wielding this kind of oblique influence on education and stuff like that. And I got pretty good at that. And we did ship it and it's still running a decade later, which is a good sign. But that is the process. And a lot of people go through that process. I saw someone had posted a meme and it's like, you one day you're just kind of working along as an engineer. And then, you pick up a whiteboard marker and, you draw a diagram and next thing you know, you're an architect and you haven't coded in 10 years, or something like that. And it's a danger, but that path happens because that is real work. There's real hard, difficult work to do. And it isn't management work and it isn't project management work, right? It is like technical work of a different nature. And so it was really interesting for me to kind of go through that process over the past, 10 or 15 years of my career as someone who just sort of been a coder, like for, 15 or 20 years, to kind of go through that process and go, oh, actually, yeah, this other kind of work is really hard. And I'm kind of the only one who can do this work right now because I have all of those pieces. I'm in the middle of that Venn diagram of like, oh, I know the technical side of it and I can talk to the human beings without staring at my shoes, So I think that's the path a lot of people follow to get to that point.
How did you end up in the current permutation of that role?
Well, yeah. So I kind of went more extreme, I guess, than most people, because I was at a point where I was talking to the chief architect at Salesforce at the time. And he said, hey, you're doing great engineering work. Thank you. It's all good. But I see that like kind of on the side, you're also like going around and like giving talks about stuff and you're like writing papers about stuff and you're trying to kind of educate people. And he's a funny guy. He's like, but I'm the chief architect. Like that's my job. And then he was like, but I hate doing that stuff and you're really good at it. So why don't you come join me on my team and you can kind of help me do that side of what I need to do here. And so that was the kind of inception of my team. That was about 10 years ago. And since then, it's really just been like, okay, cool. Like blue sky, like how can I do this effectively? And one of the aspects of it for me is that I just like, I was a liberal arts major in growing up. Like I didn't get into engineering until after college, actually. So I was bringing a whole different set of tools to this than other people were bringing. Like, yes, I can go deep and I can read a piece of code and I can, write code and all that sort of stuff, but I can also contextualize it and I can also make jokes, right? I know, they're not all about sewing babies' heads onto other babies. I can like entertain people. I can be, that person that like you start to read it, you know that feeling. You open up a technical doc about something and you start to read it and you're like, oh, I hate my life. Like this is so boring. And I was like, can I do a little better than that? Can I put a couple of funny pictures in there? Can I like make the writing flow well? And I started doing that about all these different kinds of subjects and people responded. They were like, oh, wow, thank you. Like I wouldn't have read this except for the fact that there was, a picture of Power Rangers on the front or whatever it was. And it got me interested. It made me realize that you actually gave a shit about what you were trying to communicate. And so I stuck with it and I read it. And so that, that's kind of that was the entry for me into doing that kind of work. But it's been very, very interesting because, when I started, Salesforce was relatively small. I mean, it was still a big company, but like it's much, much, much bigger now. And the kinds of problems that you address this way have only gotten bigger and bigger and bigger over time.
Yeah, that must be satisfying.
It's both. It's satisfying and it's also maddening because I'm like, oh, I'm a complete failure at my job every day. Like, here are all these people who don't know what's going on and it's all this crazy big mess, and I'm some days it feels like a drop in the bucket. But I hear from people, inside the company and they're like, no, actually even if you don't hear it every day, it does make a big difference to me that these things exist. And, trying to kind of make that sort of ripple effect where it's not just me doing that kind of stuff. It's other people, whether it's people giving talks, tech talks and things like that to other people. We have one of the things that I do is I travel a lot. We are a very distributed company, right? We have hubs in various places. I mean, the company started in San Francisco, so there's lots of people there. There's lots of people in Seattle. There's people in Atlanta. There's people all over the place, right? And it's way, way past the size where you could say, hey, just, get everybody on a plane and bring them to San Francisco for a week and we'll do a conference. Like, no, sorry, you can't do that. And yet we all know that doing just pure virtual stuff just sucks the life out of everything, right? If you never get to see people in person. So we came up with this interesting hybrid approach that we use where we kind of do a reverse conference. We take the conference presenters and we send them around to all these different offices. Like we do it every summer. We call it the Tech and Products Tour. And so I'm one of the speakers often on this tour. And so I go around to all these different offices. In fact, I'm going to New York tomorrow. And, that's like, so I get out there in front of the people on the teams and, we have conversations, we have, town hall meetings, I do talks. It's much more humanizing. And that's been a huge, important part for me of like being happy in my work is getting to see and interact with real living humans. I think that the importance of that can't be overstated. And I'm very much not a person. I've been remote since roughly since about 1999 or 2000. I've been a remote employee. So a long time. And I will never go back. I can't work in offices. I've lost the ability to tune people out when they're talking nearby me. So I can't do that. And yet I know that if I don't get that, at least occasional real human time with people, I wither. It's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough balance. I think a lot of folks are in a similar boat, maybe not having 25 years of remote work experience, but feeling like they've lost some of the abilities to work effectively in person and are withering as a consequence of some of the isolation that can come from doing remote poorly. And so that's part of our effort with the podcast is to help uncover some of the tactics that folks are using to do this, either at the individual or team or organizational level, as it is the case in yours. This kind of reverse conference idea is kind of an interesting one. I think the podcast is a manifestation of that in a way, even though it doesn't have the same kind of personal intimacy that having a live conversation in person, face to face with somebody else has. But you do develop relationships with the people that you listen to repeatedly. I forget the psychological phenomena that is that thing, but it's very much so real. I guess before we wrap up, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about a variety of different things. As you reflect on what we covered, what do you feel like you'd like listeners to take away from this conversation?
I guess it would be two things is one to sort of think and prioritize and respect the notion that is it's work to share understanding across a group of people, but it is valuable work, right? And you're probably like just based on averages and based on everyone I've seen across my career, you're probably not doing it enough and you're probably not doing it well enough, right? And so you can level up in terms of doing it more, but you can also level up in terms of doing it faster and better. And that's where like a little bit of strategic use of AI tools, as long as you're not going down the path of just like, hey, do my intellectual toil for me, can really, really help that. And so I want to encourage people to try it. I know plenty of people are, either, kind of against doing it, or maybe are just sort of, do it, but get bad results. Right. And I would urge you, like, keep trying. There's a great book that I'll recommend to folks called Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick. And I think it's the right way, the right stance to take with some of these tools right now, which is hey, I want to use this thing as sort of a co-pilot for me, can make me smarter along the way, but that can also really increase my reach and increase the velocity with which I can do things and decrease the friction of this important thing, which is sharing understanding, right? And so I think that would be my hope, is that people hear this and they're like, let me try it. Because you're not gonna, you might try the things that I said and be like, no, that didn't work at all. That was terrible. But try your own things, right? Your needs and the things that you're going to want to do are different from what I want to do with it. But try things. Like, that's the right heuristic to follow here, is try things.
Is that the book where they refer to AI not as a replication of human intelligence, but alien intelligence? Is that
I think he may have used that phrase in a couple of places in that book. And I think it's really apt. It is an alien intelligence, and yet it is also a very deeply human intelligence in a weird way, because everything that's in there is from human brains, right? And so it's more like an averaging of human brains that has superhuman speed and superhuman retention and breadth, right? But it is weirdly human in a very discomforting way.
Yeah. Well, the benefit, though, I think, of naming it or thinking of it as alien intelligence is that you assume it doesn't operate in the exact same way a human does, which maybe gives you the nudge that you need to push past the fact that it doesn't always give you the right result or the result that you're expecting or wanting. Mm-hmm. But if you think of it as this alien with these superhuman-like qualities, you would then be curious. Well, how does this work? What can I get from this? Because clearly it's got something going on. Maybe I just don't understand the contours or the ergonomics of it yet. And I think that curiosity is really worth leaning into.
Oh, absolutely. And especially when you think about its alienness from an abundance point of view, like it's, the abilities it has, it's now like this spigot on your wall that you can just turn on, and what comes out of it is intelligence, right? And so like the things you would do are really different. Like the other day I was trying to come up with a title for a talk that I'm working on. And I was just, I came up with a few and they were okay, but it wasn't quite right. And I was like, I went to Claude, of course, like if you work for a company, you have to be very careful about what you use and what you put in these models, of course. At Salesforce, like we have a whole trust layer that we go through that, helps with, making sure that this stuff isn't retained. But just by the way, audience, like when you put something in ChatGPT, that is now the property of OpenAI, unless you have some other agreement in place, right? So be careful, right? But in this case, it was, it wasn't any company confidential information I was using. And so I, went in there and I was like, hey, here's this idea of this talk I'm working on. And, here's a few titles. Can you give me 50 more? Right now, I would never go to a person and be like, hey, can you give me 50? Like that, what an asshole move. Like I would never do that. Even an intern, right. Who needed something to do. Like that's just a jerk move. But you can to Claude, and it gave me 50. And so then I had this funny experience because I read these 50 and I was like, no, these all suck. These are all terrible. This is not what I want. But it forced me to think like, well, then what do you want, Ian? Like what's missing from this? And I thought about it and I was like, oh, well, it's not kind of expressing this one kind of angle of it. So then I went back into Claude and I said, okay, well, add this other piece to it and give me another 50. Again, you'd never do that to a human, right? But then it gave me another 50. And one of that 50 was exactly what I was looking for. I was like, and then it's that kind of iteration back and forth where it's forcing you to be clear about what you want. You can do that with humans, and you absolutely, like if you're in a synchronous conversation with somebody, it might be even better or faster with the human vibe of that, like looking them in the eye and, you have more fun, right? But doing that with an AI, it's a very, very different alien process. But, if you control it well, and if you think through what you're doing, it can be incredibly productive.
No doubt. Yeah, I've had similar experiences. It's a great note to end on. And so with that, Ian, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you being generous with your time and perspective. If folks want to learn more about you or your work, where should they go?
Well, as disappointing and depressing as it may be, LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me if you want to reach out to me and message me. I don't think there's that many Ian Varleys on LinkedIn. I also have a website. You can go to ianvarley.com, or I have one where I do some occasional writing about concepts and how computers represent concepts, which is essentialist.com, but it's spelled without any of the vowels. So it's sntl.st. And so that is, you can also go there and read my thoughts on whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not.
Good deal. Well, thank you again, Ian. It's a pleasure chatting.
Likewise. Thank you, Jack.
Thanks for joining us on Distributed. If you want to learn more about what we covered in this episode, or if you want to share your own thoughts, follow @Tuple on X or visit distributed.fm.